let's begin by welcoming our special guest, the first astronaut to be trained under the Australian flag, the wonderful Katherine Bennell-Pegg. Set ourselves up here. Lovely. It's lovely to have you here, Katherine. I think we're so excited to be able to share this evening with you. Now, I'm going to kick off the first question while we get things going, and I'm sure it's a question you get asked all the time, but how did a young girl from Sydney dream of being an astronaut and then actually go on and make it happen? Please share your story with us.
Thanks, Tanya, and thanks everyone for coming tonight, especially on a cold Saturday night in Melbourne. And I'm particularly delighted to see so many young people in the audience, and I look forward to your questions. How did I become an astronaut? Well, yes, it started out with a childhood dream, and I was stubborn enough never to let go of that dream, even though I knew how unlikely it was. I remember when I was quite young, 5 or 6, something like that, I used to really like lying on the grass in my backyard where I grew up, getting bindies up my t-shirt and looking at the stars. And when my mum, who had studied physics but was an accountant, told me that some of those stars weren't, stars, they were entire worlds that no one had ever seen up close with their own eyes before, I was like, wow, well, that would be a great adventure. It's that urge of childhood, like curiosity that we all have. It's that feeling when you want to look under a rock. Do any of the kids in the audience like looking under rocks for bugs or climbing trees? It's that same feeling, I think, that's driven humans to explore and try and understand our world, and also to explore and understand space. But yeah, as I grew up, it evolved from the curiosity to wanting to be part of helping make new knowledge leaps forward in science. And now, having been a space engineer for about 15 years, it's also because I know how important space is for society in many different ways.
That's fantastic. So if you've got a dream out there, I think it shows that, just as you said, be stubborn, look at ways that you can do it, and we can make those dreams come true. So another question I'm going to start us off with, because we did just see that beautiful video commissioned by the Space Agency of Birrong, and it showcases the beginning, present and future of Australia in space, but with a really strong commitment to elevate First Nations knowledge. And so I just hoping you might touch on why is the Australian Space Agency looking to First Nations perspectives, and if you can tell us a little bit more about the partnerships and opportunities that are being put in place so that it could support more First Nations people to become involved in the space industry.
Yeah, well, when I was at university studying physics with a focus on astronomy and aerospace engineering, Australian First Nations knowledge systems and their deep knowledge of sky country was not something I was aware of or on my radar. It was kind of introduced to me when I came back to Australia from having a career overseas about 6 years ago. And at the Australian Space Agency, we feel blessed not just to live in a country with such a rich cultural heritage, but also our First Nations Australians have such a knowledge of what they call sky country. Deep in their culture is the use of the stars to guide their lives, from everything from collecting emu eggs for how and when to navigate. And a lot of it is correlation, but there are also causation elements in there, and it's really being considered at the moment across science in Australia in general, but particularly in space, how we can use the knowledge of the past to help make a better future in the way that we discover and we explore, and how that's done is still evolving. There's a new Prime Minister's Prize for Science that's looking at the usage and the preservation of Indigenous knowledge systems. So at the Australian Space Agency, we recognise this in a couple of ways. One is in our logo, so I think it's on the slide there. I also wear it here on my mission patch. The Australian Space Agency logo is made up of star constellations grouped into the shape of Australia. In a different colour represents a different constellation, and each has a different Indigenous story behind it. And it's recognising that, for tens of thousands of years, Australians looked to the sky to guide their lives, but we can now look from the sky to Earth to guide our lives, and we can go to space to make breakthroughs we can't make in any other way. At the Space Agency, we also have a First Nations engagement team, and they work across our sector to help facilitate, cultural intelligence, particularly around activities like launch and returns that are often happening in a remote and regional Australia, to make sure that we can build the relationships to do this in the best way we can.
And you've visited the Northern Territory as well as part of that, you were saying.
Oh yeah, since I came back from astronaut training about a year ago, it's been incredible to get out and about across Australia, including to remote areas, and speak to people, especially young people, about space and astronaut training, and how, striving for difficult things like working in STEM is worthwhile. And speaking to some young kids in communities in remote Australia, some of them couldn't read, but they had incredible knowledge of the stars. They were quizzing me on black holes and white holes and all sorts of things. And it just showed to me that space can connect us all. It's something that engenders awe in everybody in some way. And awe is a powerful emotion.
So yes, well, why don't we go with one of the first questions here, because I think it's quite interesting in terms of the training that you did. So someone's asked, in today's world, it seems that those who did not start young cannot reach the elite level. And so the question that was posed was, will future astronaut training involve younger candidates? But I believe as an astronaut as well, it's kind of, while your training was a year, is that right? You were training for a year, but it's really all the work that you did beforehand that is kind of made up of what you've become.
Yeah, so the criteria for astronauts has changed a lot since the beginning of the modern space era. So I think a lot of us know that, in the 60s and 70s, the profile for astronauts was usually test pilots or fast jet pilots, usually men and quite alpha in personality. That was because of the kind of missions they had to fly, proving new vehicles, highly risky missions. Today, the main destination for astronauts is the International Space Station, or soon the moon, where you go up for 6 months at a time. You need to be able to do lots of different kinds of things. You're a scientist in the sky. You're the hands and the eyes of your country's scientists on the ground. You're a technician, a space tradie fixing the space station. There's no gyms come and fix the plumbing. It's all on you, and you want that water filter to work because water's recycled up there. You're a medical practitioner looking after your crewmates. You yourself are a medical guinea pig for tests. And so you have to be a jack of all trades. And for that reason, astronauts today can have any STEM background pretty much. You can be a scientist, you can be an engineer, you can be a doctor, you can be a pilot. Now most of us are recruited like I was in our mid-30s to early 40s. And that's just fine because that means you have a career behind you. But we do see in some countries in your early 20s. But because you're waiting between missions, it's good to have a first career behind you so you can continue contributing through that career at the Space Agency too. And you've also had more of a chance to build resilience, which is an important quality astronauts need.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And so you mentioned about how at the moment, astronauts are living on the International Space Station. That's been habitable in space since the year 2000, and we're on the verge of sending people back to the moon. When do you think the first humans would land on Mars?
Oh, I think the first humans will land on Mars whenever we put our efforts and attention to it, then a time will start, right?
Because we've got the ability that we could...
Yeah, there's still work to do to get people to Mars. Today there's still new things we're discovering about what happens to your body in microgravity. In microgravity in space, weird things happen, right? Every system of your body is affected. Your bones lose bone mass at 1 to 2% a month. That's 6 to 7 times the rate of a postmenopausal woman unmedicated. We've recently discovered astronauts get blood clots up there. They have a high risk of blood clots. Your eye vision degrades. There's a lot to learn, but the good thing is, I suppose, that a lot of those mimic conditions on Earth on fast forward, so we can use them to help us develop treatments on Earth. The hardest part, aside from keeping humans alive and keeping their food fresh enough to get to Mars and back, is landing and taking off again. So we need to do that with robots first. So there's a lot left to do. But yeah, I think the future is what we make of it. And we need to think of the why. And the why will determine the timeline.
Yep. And it's also, because I suppose the difference with going to Mars, as you said, so astronauts on the International Space Station, some of the longest continual stays has been almost a year or so, whereas going to Mars, it's more like a 9-month journey, and then you need to be able to function once you get there as well. So that's a kind of another challenge that needs to be overcome. So, in fact, talking about challenges, what's been the most challenging part of becoming an astronaut?
To become an astronaut, I became a space engineer and worked on that. I mean, having a technical career, like most careers, at times it's a slog. But you just got to keep your eye on that ore that drew you into it and the bigger goal. On astronaut training, the biggest challenge for me was learning Russian. We had to learn that because the back half of the International Space Station is the Russian segment, the front half is the US segment. Everyone that goes up there has to speak English and Russian. So we had 8 weeks of lessons spread over 4 months with other things on the other 2 weeks a month to get professionally proficient. And I went into that knowing it was my weakness. So I put in extra work and felt much calmer after I passed the exam that I was going to come home having passed rather than not. But every astronaut has a strength and a weakness. In my class of 6 of us, we had all totally different backgrounds. We had a paratrooper who was also a urologist. We had an astronomer who was also in the Naval Reserve. We had a helicopter test pilot who was also an engineer. We had a neuroscientist, an aeronautical engineer, and a space engineer, me. So all of us were good at some things and not good at others. The other challenge was pacing ourselves. The training was 13 months. It was intense. We had to finish in 13 months because there were 2 spots for 2 of my classmates from Europe to go to space, and they had a critical path they had to be on. So we didn't know who it would be, so we all had to graduate at the same time. So very intense, and we had over 320 instructors over these 13 months, the best in their fields in many different disciplines from around the world. And it was such a privilege to be able to have them available to ask any questions we had. So we had to learn to pace ourselves and keep energy for the next lesson and the next day and the next module. It's a marathon, not a sprint, which is good practice for going to space, where it's similar actually.
Yes, yeah, because I've heard that up on the International Space Station, there's the red line that you need to follow. Do you want to share what that's all about?
Sure. So a typical day in space, everyone wakes up kind of around 6 o'clock and gets ready for the day. Mission control knows the astronauts are awake, usually because the toilet flush counter starts moving, because the astronauts can choose to have all the cameras and everything off out of typical working hours. People get ready for the day. They eat breakfast. For space food, it's things usually without crumbs. They don't get in your ears and your nose and so on. So it might be pancakes or a wrap or porridge, things like that. And then the astronauts have a planning conference where they speak with the people in mission control from around the world and plan out their day in detail. And everyone has effectively a row in a table, like a swim lane, and there's a red line that moves across it with the clock, and you've got to keep up. It looks a little bit like when you watch Olympic swimming and see the world record line and they're desperately trying to maintain pace. That's what it's a bit like in space. And you usually work through lunch, but you eat. Part of your day is 2 hours of exercise in the gym to maintain your health and fitness as best you can. And at the end of the day, it's usually about a 12-hour day. You might have some free time to speak to schools on the ground, additional schools, to speak to your family. Some astronauts like to do photography outside the igloo of windows at the bottom of the space station. And everyone is meant to go to bed after 9, but actually you don't need as much sleep in space, and we don't know why. So many stay up a bit longer. But the International Space Station that we've been talking about is absolutely huge. It's actually the size almost of an Australian soccer field, so 109 metres across. The internal part with air in it has about the same volume as like a 5-bedroom house, or the inside passenger part of an A380. It's got 2 gyms, 2 kitchens, although you don't really cook. You just sit around tables or float around tables and eat. It's got sleeping bays, but it's mostly just full of experimental equipment, like lab equipment. And on Saturdays, astronauts clean, because every surface has to be cleaned. It gets really dirty really fast. And Sunday is meant to be free time, but most do additional experiments. Friday night, though, is movie night. It's a team bonding thing, and they'll have a movie with a projector up there together.
Oh, I love that. So really, you're sort of bonding with friends and family, but you still have to do the mundane, the chores and everything else, but you're in this magnificent environment. I suppose, what are you most looking forward to in terms of being on, if you end up on the International Space Station?
I mean, to go to space to help make scientific breakthroughs would be an honour in any capacity. But honestly, every astronaut wants a spacewalk because it is the most challenging thing you can do mentally and physically. Usually spacewalks take 6 to 8 hours. In training too, so we did the first part of spacewalk training, and you train mostly in deep pools. So you descend under the water first in scuba gear and later in spacesuits, and instead of descending over a coral reef, you descend over a full-scale mock-up of the outside of the space station, and also for some lunar modules as well. And you run a mission. You always work in buddy pairs. You have mission control in your ear guiding you along, and you have to figure out how to move. But in training, you still feel weight. You're still heavy inside the suit. So if you're upside down, all your weight's on your shoulders, and you get quite bruised up. So you actually have to wear like a vest of like ice packs afterwards. In space, though, you again go out in pairs, and the person whose head's nearest the airlock, because you're kind of top to tail in there as all the depressurization happens, and you open the airlock, and the first person goes out, and you're told don't look down for the first few minutes, because you just get, apparently, this huge sense of vertigo. You can see features on the Earth. You can see anything bigger than like 120 metres with your own eyes. So you get that same feeling as if you were hanging out of an airplane. Of course you can't fall down. You're already falling around Earth. But the brain isn't always logical, so your body has to realise it's safe, and then you move. But from up there, you can see the aurora. You can see like bushfires, floods, pollution. You can't see borders from up there. You can see city lights and lightning, and the view's just apparently spectacular. So you get a few minutes to look at that, and then you get to work. The next place astronauts are going back to is the moon, and spacewalks up there will be next level, because you have some gravity, 1/6 gravity. For the kids in the audience, you could jump 6 times as high if you were wearing what you're wearing now on the moon, which is pretty crazy. And you come down slower as well. So up there, there's a lot of practice going into how we can move up there efficiently.
Yeah, it's incredible that because I think we're all born here on Earth. That's what most of us will only ever experience, and we just think that's how it's always got to be. But yeah, hopefully you'll get to experience a completely different way of living. Now, we've got a couple of questions here that have been voted quite highly. So it's going back to the International Space Station. And let's start with this one first. I know you get a lot. How do you poo in space?
You poo very, very carefully. So if you see an astronaut in a capsule, a Dragon or a Soyuz, which are the two that the space station uses now, China has their own station in capsules too. If you see an astronaut in a capsule going up or coming back, they are wearing a nappy. If you see them doing a spacewalk, they are wearing a nappy. And actually, the patents that went into those in the late 80s, early 90s, that underpins all the disposable diapers babies wear now and that are used in adult diapers in hospitals. So it's actually been a useful advancement. But inside the space station and inside some capsules after launch, there are toilets. The toilets don't need a seat because you don't sit down. They look like a nappy bin, actually, like a tube, and there is a bag in them for individual bagging up, just like a nappy bin. And after the number twos, you hope it's in there, and then you tie up the bag, and it gets stored on the space station sometimes for a few months until they're collected up by a cargo vehicle and burnt up in the atmosphere. So if you see a shooting star, it might be something you might not want to wish on. And for number ones, all water is recycled, including the air you breathe out and your sweat and the humidity in the air. And that is then recycled into your drinking water already the next day. So you want to make sure you know how to maintain those systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is true bonding, really, when you think about it. And now this other question is more for the women in the audience. So many of us have heard the story about how NASA was packing 100 tampons for a week-long trip into space, not really understanding the female body. And so Sarah asked, do they have more of a clue in 2025? Have things been changing?
Great question, and it's surprisingly not one I'm asked a lot on stage. Actually, women can manage up there however they wish to. There is no rule. Most women choose to take the combined pill to skip their period, but it's up to you. The problem is, though, that in recent years people have realised that you can get more blood clots in space. There was one found in an astronaut's neck by luck when she was doing an ultrasound looking at the blood flow in her neck. And we've since learnt that blood sometimes stagnates or has eddies or occasionally goes in the wrong direction in your body. So it's being looked at if that's really the right approach now. IUDs are not banned. They can be used, but again, there is a certain risk factor potentially. There's just really not been that many women in space. From a professional astronaut standpoint, for long duration missions, it's only just over 10%, which means that in terms of the amount of data we have is low. And that goes across all conditions, and it's one important reason why we need more women to be astronauts, not just to harness their talent, but for the medical research that goes on up there. So yeah, anything's possible, and you can use the urine system can filter out all of that, so it's perfectly fine, and women are really open about it. Talking in the classes. In my astronaut class, there's 3 women and 3 men. So so-called women's issues, which are everyone's issues if you're in a team, are talked about openly. It was not something we had to whisper about in the corridors.
Yeah, which is good. And I think society as a whole is changing in that way as well. And part of that is what you're doing in space. So let's bring us back down to Earth for a little bit. The question here is that apart from being an astronaut, what are some other fantastic jobs that you can get as part of the Australian Space Agency?
In the Australian Space Agency and in the space sector more broadly, there's so many different things that can be done and that need to be done. Pretty much, if you think of any job and put the word space in front of it, you can do it. In the space sector, we need truck drivers to drive the trucks. We need nutritionists to do their research and help the astronauts stay healthy. We need people that are tailors and seamstresses to stitch together the thermal blankets that go around satellites and on spacesuits. We need scientists to ask the big questions and engineers to invent solutions so they can answer them. We need people in policy to help using space for international diplomacy and developing programs. We need program managers. We need lawyers. Australia is represented in the UN for space to help work on developing the norms and standards to help the world figure out how to be more responsible in its use of space for all. We need artists and communicators at the Space Agency. There's a communications team. They are space communications professionals and science communicators too. So if people out there don't think STEM's for them and it's not for everybody, that's fine. People should follow their passion but still want to work in space. There is absolutely a place for them too.
Yeah, and so people have asked what subjects you need to study in years 11 and 12 to become an astronaut. I mean, I think what you're saying is really broadly in the space industry, we need all different types of people. So I suppose more to what was your pathway when you were going through school?
So when I went through school, I was really interested in astronomy, like you were, I imagine. And it's because that inspiration and that awe for me came from mostly looking at the sky, although I did love nature around me. And I like the logic of physics. So I studied, at high school I studied physics, chemistry, extension maths, advanced English and economics and geography. But I was also someone that had a lot of hobbies. I like sports, I like drama, I like music. I liked English as much as I like science. So I would just encourage people to follow their passion. If you follow something that's interesting to you and you can make a career out of it, and if you want to be an astronaut, it's STEM, then pursue that, because it means you have a more fulfilling life. When times are tough, you'll enjoy the effort. And if you do well, more doors open for you. So that would be my advice. It's the advice most astronauts give, just because we see that breadth of people that come through. And everyone that got far in astronaut selection were people that truly loved the jobs they already did. And becoming an astronaut for them is just the cherry on the top of a career path that they loved anyway.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So we've got a few more questions that are taking us back out into space. One of them, have you been given any insight about how food might taste differently in space? And also, I would imagine, like, you're in that confined space, and so the smells and the sounds would also be quite different. What are you expecting when you get the chance to go there?
Yeah, so in space, your body has what's called fluid shifts, particularly over the first couple of weeks or so. It's almost like you've been hanging upside down a bit, and you feel a bit stuffy, like you have a cold, so you really can't taste that well. So astronauts usually prefer really strong tasting food, spicy food, salty food, savoury food. So for the kids in the audience that might be fussy with food, you'll eat more things in space. You'll enjoy them more. You also have to have food that doesn't create crumbs. Like I said before, it can get in your eyes or your ears or some equipment. Food also has to have a shelf life of 2 years or more, which is really tough, and is sterile when it goes up there. So you don't have, live food like yogurt cultures. Fruit can go up if it's been made safe, and then it's like Christmas. If a crew brings up a bag of apples or oranges, it's like a gift that everyone's excited for. I do have a friend of mine, a German astronaut, who really missed fresh Greek yogurt. And so he made contraband yogurt in space out of the probiotic powder and milk powder, and stirred it up and put it near a heat source. And then he ate some and was fine, and then told the flight surgeons after, and they all freaked out. But it was okay because he didn't introduce any pathogens. And so now there's a living probiotic culture up there.
And talk about, overcoming challenges and finding ways around. That's great. Now, into the more, as you were talking before about the blood clots and things, you are testing your body to the limit when you're out into space. So this question in particular was about, in a medical emergency, how do you do CPR in space? Because you don't have that gravity kind of to work against them.
So I talked about we practice doing spacewalks by scuba diving deep in pools. We also practice them by going on a zero-G plane or a vomit comet. Luckily no vomit floating around in the comet I was on. But it is a plane that the seats are removed from most of it, and it's padded, and it flies like a roller coaster. And when it's falling, it's like skydiving with a plane around you, so you don't feel an air rush, and it feels and looks just like you're in space. And so we say zero-G colloquially, right? If the plane was flying normally straight and level, you'd feel gravity. When the plane is falling at the same rate around you, you feel weightless or zero-G, just like in orbit going around the Earth. And we practice things like CPR on that. We can't practice it underwater because water's heavy. If you try and move your arm through water, it takes some effort. If you move your arm through air, air compresses, so it doesn't take much effort at all. So when you try and move around in zero-G inside these planes, you're like a ping pong ball. It's really hard to stay still. If you stub your toe, your feet end up on the roof. You could spot the rookie astronauts like me versus the ones that had lived in space, who are really calm and still. And we practice CPR up there. And if you stand or kneel next to somebody and do CPR in weightlessness and zero-G, you'll fly away. You can't be very helpful. So what you actually do is you do a handstand on the person, and put your feet on the roof and hold your arms up and do squats. And it's actually much easier than normal CPR just because you're working in one line. We also had to learn how to use tools like a drill. If you don't hold on when you use a drill, you spin too. So it's,
physics in action.
Yeah, it's really good for that action-reaction demonstration.
So this one here, it's about, okay, so this is more, we're talking about space futures. And so what's your view of, do you think we should set up infrastructure on the moon to enable future exploration, or should we be just going direct to other locations like Mars? Because we have been to the moon before. Is there more to learn?
Yeah, there's so much more that remains to be learned by going to the moon. So when humans went to the moon, you know, around 60 years ago now, it was for national pride. It was a race to the moon. Science was done, absolutely, but it wasn't the overall objective. The overall objective was proving ground. And in the missions that were there, yeah, we learned so much about the Earth, the rocks that were brought back. I was lucky enough to see and even hold some of them with gloves on during the astronaut training when we studied geology, and still scientific papers are being produced from them today. But those astronauts were sent to the equatorial regions of the moon because they're easier to reach. And if you think in the moon in a month, if you're on the equator, you get about 2 weeks as a day, daylight, and then 2 weeks of darkness. There's a far and a close side of the moon, not a dark and a light side of the moon. And we don't really have the technology to survive the lunar night. It's so, so cold. In fact, in the polar regions of the moon, there are areas where light never hits because they're valleys, and they're the coldest parts of the solar system. And think about that, how far away Neptune is. The poles of our moon are thought to be the coldest. So the place that humans are being prepared to go back to now is the South Polar region, because South has got some geologically interesting sites. And there at the peaks of the hills and the valleys are permanently lit regions. So you can have a permanent base to do science. And you can study those dark areas and study the light areas too. And the purpose of going back is to do a lot of science. Just one of the kinds of science is geology. So the most accepted theory is that the Earth and the Moon were formed from a collision of 2 bodies a very long time ago, and they collided and got partially molten and spun up, and then a chunk spun off and solidified, which is the Moon, and the Earth solidified. But the Earth is so big that it's still got active plate tectonics and volcanoes, it's got weathering. The Moon kind of froze a lot earlier. So we can't see what the early Earth was like on Earth. The Earth's a great recycler, and the Moon is like a museum. So by going to the Moon, we can learn about the early Earth, what's going on deep inside our crust, and that's useful because the geothermal inputs into our climate change models, and our climate models, for example, they are the lowest understood parts of it. So that will help us there. That's just one example. Australia is part of it too, not with people at this point, but certainly with robotics. Australia's got fabulous, what we call field robotics. That's robotics not in labs, so out in our farms, in our mines, in our oceans, that can work in these really challenging environments. And we've also got really good autonomous systems capabilities, robots working together, working around humans in really complex systems. And that is a capability that we don't have in space yet. So looking to translate that to the Moon, we're starting with a rover called Rover. It was a public competition, a 20-kilo rover that's going to go to the Moon in support of NASA exploring up there. We also have some smaller payloads, geology payloads, astrobotany payloads to learn about growing plants up there, and many more.
Yeah, no, it's really exciting, and I mean, I feel like we've often been talking about, oh, very soon we'll be going to the Moon, but it really is happening now with both the Artemis missions and also China as well. Now, I know that Australia is very young in terms of, like our space agency was only established in 2018. But we were one of the founding members of the Artemis Accords, which is what countries are signing to make sure that we can all work together. Are you able to share a little bit more information about that? Because previously when kind of the moon landings were happening, it was really just the US, whereas now it is much more of the world that is going to be up there and working together.
Absolutely. So we've learned over the past decades that we go much further with space exploration and scientific endeavour when we work together. In fact, one of the main reasons countries do exploration beyond the scientific discovery is to help create these links between like-minded and non-like-minded nations where you can find commonality and common purpose in species-level discovery and have positive outcomes there. The International Space Station, for example, has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for what it's done for diplomacy around the world. The Artemis Accords are a series of agreements about how the countries that want to work together on the moon are going to work together. So Australia was one of the early signatories to the Moon Treaty, way back at the start of the modern space era, and we were part of the first group of countries. I think we were the fourth to sign up to what's called the Artemis Accords, and there's now over 50 countries have signed, which is really great.
No, it's fantastic. And I suppose to the question here was about, so like, can we catch up and be a big player? And I think in terms, in space, and I think in terms of like the rover, the lunar lander, and would you say that other countries want to work with Australia in space?
Absolutely. I mean, when I was on astronaut training, there were a lot of different space agencies that would pass through the astronaut centre, and everyone was so delighted to see that Australia has a space agency, now 7 years old, that they were doing all these amazing activities, and we're delighted by what we could bring. We're still emerging as a space sector. We've been there since the beginning of the modern space era with rockets launching out of Woomera, and we're one of the first countries to develop its own satellite, but we didn't keep pace when the rest of the world accelerated in the intervening decades. It's only in the last 15 years, 10 years or so, where we've seen the miniaturization of electronics, meaning that startups and universities can make satellites. So Australia's modern space sector started bottom up. And these groups lobbied to have a space agency, and I thank them because that brought me back to Australia, and are doing all this incredible work. So where Australia is playing is where we have strengths in our niches. One of my first jobs when I came back to Australia in 2019, at the end of 2019, was to look across the country and be like, what are we world leading in, or could be world leading in space and in industries that are close to space, like field robotics, and then use that to focus our strategy. And I found that we have so many capabilities. Most of them come from how we've had to learn to live and work off our vast and remote land. Technologies that come with remote medical care, for example, how we look after our Antarctic expeditioners and our flying doctor service, our operational capabilities useful for astronauts in space. And what I like about when we have lots of industries involved is you get what's called a virtuous innovation cycle, where you learn together across industries, and you can do so much more than if you just develop things alone. Working in space, you get to work in consortiums and show off your capabilities as well, which helps to further what you're doing. One thing that's really taken off, pardon the pun, in the last year is returns to Australia. So capsules coming back from space. Australia has hosted capsules from space agencies before, coming back to Woomera. We've had asteroid samples come back to Woomera. One in 2020, in the height of the COVID pandemic, was samples from a, I think, 4.2 billion year old asteroid, Ryugu. Japan sent out a probe, took some samples and brought it back and landed it in Woomera. They had to get the samples, find them, get them back to Japan within a very short time frame, and we're able to support them to do that. What we've had happen this year, though, is a commercial company have the world's first ever commercial capsule return to a commercial spaceport, and that was here in Australia. And they backed it up again 10 weeks later, and there's a third one on orbit that's due to come back soon. And what those capsules are usually containing is pharmaceutical products that use microgravity to be developed in a way you can't develop them on Earth. And I could speak for hours on that, but needless to say that drugs, mainstream drugs like Keytruda, which is Merck's immunotherapy cancer drug, are being advanced through space. In that one's case, looking to move from an IV bag to a subcutaneous injection. The cancer drug, the name escapes me, the antiviral drug, I forget it, but there's a drug for Remdesivir, I think, Remdesivir. It's a drug that is used in hospital settings when people have COVID as an antiviral. They've now been able to give that to people that have comorbidities like kidney disease because of advances in space and understanding it at the molecular level better. And the list goes on. So Australia is now able to be part of this economy too. So yeah, the future is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, it really is. And every part of our lives is going to be touched by what's happening out into space. Staying on the Australian theme, we've got Nishan from North Melbourne Primary School. Thanks for coming along tonight, Nishan. And they want to know what made it easier or harder to train under the Australian flag compared to maybe a different country.
So it's a huge honour for me to have the chance to represent Australia. When I was dreaming of being an astronaut growing up, I never dreamt that I could be an Australian astronaut. We didn't have a space agency, let alone a pathway to representing our country. Actually, when I applied to be an astronaut, I applied to be a British European Space Agency astronaut. I have a passport through my mother, but I was born and grew up and mostly educated at university in Australia. And I was thrilled to have the chance to apply. It was the first time I'd ever had the chance to apply to a human spaceflight program. Australia's never yet had an open call. And I went through the year and a half, 6 knockout rounds, which itself was amazing, such an adventure. And at the end, after I passed, they said due to my limited connections to Europe, they reached out to Australia and said, we'll take Katherine if she represents Australia, and the Australian government said yes, and I'm so grateful. Not just because it means I get to represent my home country, but that this cracks the door open for an open call one day in the future when the time is right, because we'll have the information to make that decision, and I would love to see that happen in time. And also in the shorter term, being able to help our scientists and engineers to be able to access this world, to be able to put their experiments and their equipment and their technologies in these in-space labs, because we have so much to offer. When I was at the Astronaut Centre, there was a delegation of Australian companies and researchers showing off their capabilities, and everyone was blown away. So yeah, loving having that chance, and also to show that it is possible to have this path as an Australian. I think that's really important, and it's been very humbling to speak to young people about that when I've got out to schools.
Yeah, no, thank you for being a fantastic role model and trailblazing this for us. I think it's really fantastic. We appreciate it. And so I suppose on the line with that is, what were some of the biggest obstacles that you had to overcome in pursuit of becoming an astronaut?
I think, look, there are a lot of obstacles in terms of how hard I had to work and moving around the world, but I never made a decision that I would have regretted if I hadn't become an astronaut. You craft a life you love anyway, and you just hope you'll have the chance to apply. I lived overseas for 12 years, which is a blessing, but it's also challenging. I had to, move my family. I've got 2 kids and a husband, move our family across the world with about a month's notice to go do astronaut training, and you make it happen. But it's challenging, and it can be hard on the family too, even though there's good bits. So I would say, yeah, being an astronaut is a family endeavour, and I hope to share all the good bits as well as the challenging bits with them.
Yeah, no, that's lovely, and great that you've had the support, because I think that's true for all of us. We can't do this alone, and it's great that you've been able to share that. So actually, this is a really interesting question too along these lines. Someone's asked, I've always think of astronauts as exceptionally mentally well people. So how do you manage emotions like anxiety and mental well-being, both, I suppose, through your training and then when you're up in space as well?
Yeah, mental well-being is a huge focus of astronaut selection and training, because a lot of it can be trained and managed. During selection, psychology played a part in every single round. So the first round in person was tests on a computer, similar to anyone that's tried out to be a pilot, hand-eye coordination, memory, English, maths, physics, logic, things like that. But there was a psychology questionnaire in there, and it was rapid fire, and you had to beat the clock and hope you don't click the wrong button, about how what motivates you and what you would do in different decisions. We had to write handwritten essays at that point. We all thought they were analysing our handwriting. They weren't. It was just so that they told us later so that we couldn't remember what we'd written after the test day. And then the second round after that, when we were down to 300 or 400 people, was a psychology round. It was a full day at the Astronaut Centre for groups of 7 or 8 at a time per day. And we were followed around by multiple people watching each of us. There were astronauts that are current as part of that. And they told us that there was no particular personality type per se that they were targeting. They were looking for people that didn't have an extreme in sort of any personality metric, because that would indicate an inflexibility. And they need you to be flexible to different conditions. They need you to be able to handle yourself and perform in times of uncertainty and stress, and when you don't know if an outcome will ever happen. You know, as an astronaut, you don't know if you'll ever get a mission. Once you get a mission, things change. You have to be able to maintain your motivation and steady yourself in those times. They also need you to have no aggressive tendencies, but equally not take blame when it's not yours to take. You're representing your country. You don't take blame on their behalf either. And have an optimism bias. So you look for the positive in things, and have positive spirals, not negative spirals, which can cause you to have inaction and toxicity. During the training, we had psychological support. Astronauts build relationships with psychological teams because they have regular meetings when they're in space, usually every 2 weeks or so, depending on the mission, with someone that they already trust. We have a human behaviour and performance model. If you Google that, HBPISS, you'll see an old version, and there's got a number of performance metrics related to how you perform in space as an individual and as a team. One of those metrics is self-care. Self-care is not optional in training and in space. It's a measure of your performance. If you are burning yourself out, you are letting the team down. So that is was kind of a change of mindset for many people that work hard, in that you have to rest enough to perform, not work hard enough to deserve rest, because at any moment you might be called upon unexpectedly to deal with an emergency, and if you don't have enough fuel in the tank to deal with that properly, you're not doing your job. So it's about having that pacing that I thought was really interesting. And ultimately, one of the things that I think's relevant across all that is to be able to draw on something that gives you energy, and for many people that is awe, that feeling of feeling small and having that humility and being part of something larger than yourself.
Yeah, no, I think, once again, we just come to it that all this work that's going into preparing you for space and learning about space, there's so many lessons that we can take on board for here on Earth. Now, we're almost at the end of the evening. It's gone so fast. You're an amazing person to speak to. Just to finish up, I think this question is quite interesting. So they ask, is the private sector space exploration beneficial for humanity long term, or is it just creating more pollution and exclusivity for the rich?
It's a good question. I mean, right now, the view for space amongst most of the world is as commercial as possible, as government as necessary, because that's how you get, it's thought, the most efficient outcome for the money invested. If we look just at commercial launch, over the past decade, that's brought down the cost of putting something in space by 20 times. If you just think how much taxpayer money that's saved, that's quite incredible, because they're commercially driven to deliver. So capabilities are often developed through governments, because it might be a long lead time till they're realised, but as soon as they can be commercialised, they usually are. In Australia, we are a space sector emerging in this more commercial space era, so we don't have to turn the ship, so we can tailor ourselves more for that world. And in our sector, a lot of the investment is private, which means the taxpayer doesn't have to cover that part of it. If we're talking about space tourism, for example, which I think that question was getting at, I think as long as it's done responsibly and sustainably, and what that exactly means is still being figured out, that space tourism does have a place. I think of it a bit like Antarctic tourism. There's Antarctic expeditioners doing a job down there. There's people that go there for tourism. Now, when they go there for tourism, they usually value the environment. They come back with beautiful photos about Antarctica that they share with the people they know and spread an important environmental message. It's the same for space tourism. If everyone went to Antarctica, it would destroy the environment. If everyone went to space with current technology, probably similarly. So how do we decide who gets to go? Right now, the free market decides that. Is that the right way? I don't know. But I think it's good that the ability for people to go to space is broadening. We're seeing some countries like Italy, like Turkey, putting their astronauts on these short duration missions as training flights. We're seeing some scientists that have relevant experiments that you can do in a few minutes going up on these flights too. So it's going to be really interesting. Low Earth orbit, which is the orbit close to Earth, like where the space station is looking to have a more commercial future because the technology is within reach now of commercial organisations. But when we look out to the moon, it'll still be government driven for quite some time, even if companies are providing the infrastructure and government's the customer. So yeah, it's an interesting time, and I think we just have to keep working on getting that balance right, and that requires a whole ecosystem effort and a public effort. But it's important to get it right because space is not a luxury, it's not a need to have, it's a must have. I think of space like the ocean, right? It's an industry with so many different applications and players in it, and just like the ocean, it's a place. So space is a place that is the ultimate high point, and from this high point, you can see phenomenon all around the world. You can see phenomenon like bushfires and floods and their indicators. You can see evidence of hotspots for modern slavery. You can see where refugees need food drops. What you can see from up there, you can connect. Like a super high mobile phone tower, if you can see 2 points, you can send a message between them. And what is on that message is information. Things like GPS, timing data, position data. Your bank works when you tap your card to pay because of timing data underpinning the banking system from space. And what all this creates is an in-space economy, launches and returns, in the future in-space servicing and so on, which itself has an economic impact. And because of that, the space sector itself is meant to triple in size between 2024 and 2035. So that's an economic opportunity. That's not even considering how it underpins all of our other industries, especially here in Australia. And then there's the human spaceflight element, which isn't about going up there and taking a selfie. It's about discovery, particularly in pharmaceuticals, particularly in materials. So it's one of the challenges space has is its breadth, but it's also why it's so powerful and why we need to make sure that we use space sustainably and don't fill it with space junk, because we need that position to offer all these services to Earth.
So thank you for bringing some of that awe and insight to us this evening. We wish you all the best for that chance when you do get to sit on a rocket and blast off into space. I'm sure all of us will be wishing that we were there with you. So please, everyone, let's thank Katherine.